Deep tragedy lay alongside the final words of convicted Aileen Wuornos. As Aileen told her own story, she unveiled the dark side of society for all to see. She reignited ancient debates about crime and justice. Did society truly create criminals, or are they merely reflections of individual evil? What drives a person to such extreme lengths? Aileen Wuornos' story stands at the very center of these questions. But who was truly responsible for her transformation into a monster? Childhood and trauma. Aileen Carol Pittman, Wuornos' maiden name, was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her story seemed written with tragedy from the day she was born. It began with a family that had married young, could not cope with life, and fell apart within a short time. Her mother, Aileen Wuornos, was only 14 years old when she married her father, the 18-year-old Leo Pittman. It was clear this marriage would be filled with problems. Diane's older brother, Aileen's grandfather, was born when he was only 15 years old, but the marriage was short-lived. A divorce case was filed just 2 months before Aileen's birth in 1956. Aileen's father, Leo Pittman, was a violent man with a troubled personality. Aileen never had the opportunity to meet him. That was because he had already abandoned the family before Aileen was born. However, Pittman's dark past cast a shadow over Aileen's life. In 1967, Leo Pittman was arrested for kidnapping and molesting a young girl and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia in prison, but on January 30th, 1969, he ended his life by hanging himself. Aileen grew up learning these tragic truths about her father at a young age. When she was only 4 years old, her mother Diane also abandoned the children. In January 1960, Diane left both Aileen and her brother Keith with their grandmothers Britta and grandfathers Laurie, completely transferring their care to their grandparents. This abandonment was one of the first major traumas in Aileen's life. On March 18, 1960, Laurie and Britta Wuornos formally adopted Aileen and Keith. However, this new life was neither safer nor more filled with love. On the contrary, the difficulties and traumas in Aileen's life deepened further. The violence of grandfather Laurie, Aileen's grandfather Laurie, and grandmother Britta were Finnish Americans who were born in Lee, Finland, and later emigrated to America. They had established a new life in Michigan. However, Laurie's alcohol addiction did not create a safe and warm environment in this home. Laurie was a disciplined and authoritarian man, and he reinforced this authority through repeated violence. Aileen, still a small child, became a victim of this violence. Her grandfather engaged in both physical and sexual assault. He forced her to remove her clothing before beating her a horrific reality that Aileen herself described. This unsafe home environment laid the foundation for Aileen's future behaviors. Early trauma and risky behavior when Aileen was only 11 years old. She embarked on a dangerous path to cope with her adverse circumstances. At this age, she began engaging in sexual activities at school in exchange for cigarettes, food, and other items. The rumors about her having sexual relations with her brother Keith were another reflection of the conditions she was in. Through these behaviors, Aileen was both trying to survive and developing a type of defense mechanism against those around her. This kept her physically alive on one hand while opening deep emotional wounds on the other. Rape at age 14, by the time she was 14, Aileen was raped by a family friend. Following this assault, she became pregnant. This event was one of the most significant breaking points in her life. At such a young age, as a result of trauma, she was confronted with motherhood. On March 23, 1971, Aileen gave birth to a baby boy in a home created for unwed mothers. The child was immediately placed for adoption, and Aileen had to continue with her life. Just a few months after this event, her grandmother Britta died of liver failure. With this loss, the sense of security in Aileen's life completely disappeared. Shortly after her grandmother's death, when she was only 15 years old, her grandfather Laurie threw her out of the house. Without a home, Aileen could not find a safe place to live and began sheltering in wooded areas in Michigan. Street life and prostitution during this difficult period. She began engaging in prostitution to make a living. She hitchhiked while traveling and made money by arranging brief encounters with clients. These harsh years spent on the streets left deep marks on Aileen's personality. She was both trying to learn how to protect herself in a world full of violence and developing various defense mechanisms to cope with her loneliness. The violence and exploitation she encountered during this period made Aileen's already complicated emotional structure even more distorted. The path she chose to survive trapped her in a vicious cycle. Insecurity and fear became the fundamental factors determining her behavior. Under these circumstances, Aileen developed deep anger and distrust towards society and people. These dark emotions within her would eventually lead her to make decisions that affected both her own and others' lives. First marriage and college in 1976, seeking change. Aileen hitchhiked to Florida. There she met Louis Gratz-Fell, a 69-year-old yacht club president. Their relationship developed rapidly, and they married shortly after. The marriage announcement appeared in the local newspaper's society page. This seemed like the beginning of a stable period in Aileen's life, but the reality was very different. From the first days of Aileen's marriage, constant fights broke out in local bars. She was briefly imprisoned due to aggressive behavior. She even beat Fell with his own cane, and after this incident, Fell obtained a restraining order against her. This marriage lasted only a few weeks and ended in chaos and violence. Aileen left Florida and returned to Michigan. Entering crime, 1970s and 1980s when she returned to Michigan. Problems did not leave her alone. On July 14, 1976, in a bar called the Burn Club in Meldona, she was arrested for throwing a billiard ball at a bartender's head and charges of assault and disturbing the peace. Shortly after this incident, on July 17, 1976, her brother Keith died of esophageal cancer. With Keith's death, Aileen inherited $10,000 from her brother's life insurance. This money provided temporary relief in her life. In August 1976, Aileen was fined $105 for driving under the influence in Michigan. She used money from her brother's inheritance to pay the fine. With the remaining money, she bought luxury items for herself and even purchased a new car. However, she spent this money quickly and soon had to scrap the car she had bought. The loss of her brother, the end of her marriage, and financial hardship pulled Aileen into an even deeper emotional darkness. During this dark period, Aileen attempted suicide multiple times. In 1978, at age 22, she tried to end her life by shooting herself in the stomach. Throughout her life, it is known that she attempted suicide a total of 6 times between the ages of 14 and 22. However, each time she survived, and these internal conflicts only hardened her further. Criminal career in the 1980s, Aileen's crimes continued and escalated. On May 20th, 1981, in Edgewater, Florida, she was arrested for armed robbery of a store. In this incident, she had stolen only $35 and 2 packages of cigarettes. On May 4th, 1982, she was convicted and received a short prison sentence. However, on June 30th, 1983, she was released. Her crimes did not end. On May 1st, 1984, while attempting to use a forged check at a bank in Key West, she was arrested again. In November 1985, she was listed as a suspect in connection with the theft of a firearm and ammunition. Aileen's life was spent in constant conflict with crime and the law. On January 4th, 1986, Aileen was arrested again in Miami on charges of auto theft and using false identification. Police found a .38 caliber firearm and ammunition in the car at the scene. During this period, Aileen was attempting to evade the law by using false identities in addition to her crimes. However, these efforts could not prevent her capture. In 1986, while armed in a friend's car, she drew a gun and demanded money, leading to her being taken into custody. Police found a firearm under the passenger seat where Aileen was sitting. Aileen was becoming increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Relationship with Terry Mirai. 1986. Aileen met Terry Moore, a woman named Terry Moore, at a gay bar called Zodiac in Daytona Beach. Moore was a motel maid. The two quickly grew closer and began living together. Aileen continued to work as a prostitute to support Moore. This relationship with Moore became an important period in Aileen's life. It served as a type of emotional refuge for her. However, financial difficulties and Aileen's criminal tendencies constantly strained their relationship. On July 4th, 1987, Daytona Beach police questioned Aileen and Moore for allegedly attacking someone with a beer bottle in a bar. However, despite all these incidents, Moore continued to stand by Aileen. On March 12, 1988, Aileen was again charged following a confrontation with a bus driver. Aileen claimed the driver had forcibly ejected her from the bus, and Moore was presented as a witness in this matter. Moore held a very important place in Aileen's life. However, this relationship alone could not put Aileen's crime-filled life in order. These upheavals and tragic events caused Aileen's life to become increasingly dark. The murder series, 1991st victim, Richard Charles Mallory, 51 years old. Aileen Wuornos' first murder was a turning point in her criminal career and propelled her tragic life story down an even darker path. By the end of 1989, Aileen was making a living by hitchhiking and engaging in prostitution to survive. In a world constantly filled with danger, she was both earning money and struggling to survive. Aileen's first murder occurred on November 30th, 1989, when she killed a man named Richard Charles Mallory. Richard Mallory was the owner of an electronics store in Florida. Aileen had gotten into his car while hitchhiking. According to Aileen's account, while traveling with Mallory, an agreement was made between them. Mallory would pay for sexual services. However, this agreement quickly turned into a horrific event. According to Aileen's allegations, Mallory took her to an isolated area and assaulted her there. She stated that Mallory had raped her and threatened her life. According to Aileen's account, Mallory attempted to rape her by binding her, and she was forced to defend herself. Aileen drew a firearm that she had hidden in the car and fired at Mallory. She shot him several times at the scene and left his body in the forest. Important detail. It was later discovered that Richard Mallory had been convicted of attempted rape. In Maryland in 1961, when investigators examined Mallory's files, they found that he was noted to have strong sociopathic tendencies. However, most of these pieces of evidence were not accepted in court. After Mallory's death, Aileen took his car and belongings and quickly fled the scene. This behavior later raised questions about the true motivation behind her actions. Aileen continued to use Mallory's car and made purchases with his credit cards. Following Mallory's disappearance, the police investigation that was initiated was solved because of Aileen's use of these items. The Mallory murder changed many things in Aileen's life. She claimed to have killed a man for self-defense. However, following this incident, she continued to kill other men in similar situations. Second victim, David Andrew Spears, 43 years old, Aileen's second known victim, was 43-year-old David Andrew Spears. Spears was a construction worker living in the Winter Garden area of Florida. He was reported missing on May 19, 1990. On June 1, 1990, Spears' naked body was found along U.S. Route 1 in Citrus County, Florida. Aileen had shot him 6 times with a .22 caliber firearm. The bullet wounds found in Spears' body illustrated the brutality of the act. The fact that the victim was found naked suggested that Aileen had removed his clothing before killing him. This indicated that the victim may have been trying to defend himself, or that Aileen wanted to keep him under a certain level of control. Third victim, Charles Carskadden, 40 years old. Aileen's next victim was Charles Chuck Carskadden. He was 40 years old and worked as a part-time rodeo worker. His death occurred just a few weeks after Spears was murdered. Aileen had begun committing murders more quickly and in rapid succession. The day Carskadden was killed was recorded as May 31, 1990. On June 6, 1990, Carskadden's body was found in Pasco County. The body was wrapped in an electric blanket and had decomposed significantly. Carskadden's body had been shot 9 times with a .22 caliber firearm. This was the same gun used to shoot Mallory. After committing the murder, Aileen had used the victim's belongings. Witnesses saw Aileen driving Carskaddon's car. Additionally, it was confirmed that Aileen had sold a firearm belonging to Carskaddon at pawn shops. As with the Spears murder, Aileen's actions in this case were critical errors that revealed her identity and accelerated her capture. The fact that Carskaddon had been shot 9 times was clear evidence that Aileen had become increasingly brutal. Fourth victim, Peter Seams, 65 years old, body. Never found. Aileen's fourth known victim was Peter Seams. The case contained important details that differed from others. In June 1990, Seams set out for Arkansas, but never reached his destination and disappeared. Seams's disappearance contained several important details different from the other murders. Aileen had committed a few weeks after Seams's disappearance. On July 4, 1990, his car was found abandoned in Orange Springs, Florida. This made the disappearance case even more suspicious for authorities. The examination of the car revealed Aileen's connection to this murder. Eyewitnesses had seen Aileen and her girlfriend Terria Moore leaving Seams's car together. This testimony was an important clue that confirmed Aileen's role in this case. During investigations, Aileen's fingerprint was found on the interior door handle. This print confirmed that she had used Seams's car and made her a primary suspect. In this disappearance case, however, Seams's body was never found. His disappearance and Aileen's connection to this incident left many unanswered questions about how Seams was killed or what exactly happened to him. This case made the criminal partnership between Aileen and Terria Moore more apparent. Fifth victim, Troy Eugene Burris, 50 years old. Aileen's fifth known victim was 50-year-old Troy Eugene Burris. He was known to work as a sausage salesman in Ocala, Florida. He was a man with an ordinary work life, just like the other victims Aileen targeted. When Aileen's paths crossed with his in July 1990, his tragic end became inevitable. Troy Burris disappeared on July 31, 1990. That day, he was traveling in his area of Ocala, selling his products according to his normal work routine. However, he did not return home that day and was reported missing by his family. Burris's sudden disappearance was a source of great concern for his family and friends. Just a few days after Burris's disappearance, on August 4, 1990, his body was found in a wooded area near State Road 19 in Marion County. Unlike Aileen's previous murders, Burris's body was discovered within a relatively short time. According to the autopsy performed, Burris had been killed by gunshots. Like Aileen's other victims, Burris had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm. The location where the victim's body was found showed that Aileen usually ambushed her victims in isolated and remote areas. These were strategic locations Aileen had chosen to commit her crimes. After killing Burris, leaving his body in this wooded area was a sign that she was trying to cover her tracks. However, her tendency to keep her victims' belongings and the traces she left at crime scenes prevented her from completely covering her tracks. As with Burris, this murder was part of a pattern in which Aileen used the victims' cars to escape after committing the murders. While self-defense claims were the focus of her first murders, There were now more victims and murders committed in rapid succession. This murder showed that Aileen's actions had evolved beyond a simple self-defense mechanism into a type of serial killer behavior. Sixth victim, Charles Richard Humphreys, 50 years old. Aileen's sixth known victim was 50-year-old Charles Richard Humphreys. Humphreys had a different position compared to Aileen's other victims. He was a retired United States Air Force officer. However, even this experienced background was not enough to save him from Aileen. Charles Humphreys disappeared on September 11, 1990. He was traveling that day and was expected to return home after conducting his business. However, when he did not come home, his family became concerned and reported him missing. Just one day later, on September 12, 1990, his body was found in an isolated area in Marion County. Unlike Aileen's other victims, Humphreys's body was found fully clothed. Examination of the body revealed that he had been shot 7 times. The bullets that struck his head and body showed that Aileen had used the same firearm in this murder as well. Following the discovery of Humphreys's body, a search of his car found it abandoned in Severn County. As with Aileen's other murders, she had used the victim's car for a period of time and then abandoned it. However, the traces she left behind and witnesses provided critical clues that accelerated her capture. The tragic death of a man like Humphreys resulted in Aileen's crimes receiving more attention in the media and causing greater impact in society. Seventh victim, Walter Geno Antonio, 61 years old. Aileen's last known victim was 61-year-old Walter Geno Antonio. Unlike Aileen's other victims, Antonio had multiple professions. He worked as a truck driver, security guard, and also served as a reserve police officer. Walter Antonio became Aileen's target in November 1990. His body, found nearly naked, was discovered on November 19, 1990, near a remote forest road in Dixie County, Florida. The autopsy performed revealed that Antonio had been shot 4 times. The .22 caliber firearm, Aileen's typical weapon, was used in this murder as well. The location where Antonio's body was found was one of the isolated areas Aileen typically preferred. 5 days after Antonio was killed, his car was found abandoned in Brevard County. As with Aileen's other murders, she had used the victim's car and later abandoned it. The killing of Walter Geno Antonio represented one of the peak points of violence in Aileen's criminal career. Arrest and manhunt Walter Geno Antonio's death served as a kind of conclusion to Aileen's murder series. With this murder, Aileen had created serious panic in society and drawn even more media attention to herself. The process leading to Aileen's capture resulted from a complex series of events and police investigation. Aileen's murders had taken place in different states and isolated areas. However, certain traces and connections that caught the authorities' attention eventually helped them solve her crimes. As police discovered the abandoned cars and belongings of missing men, they began to realize that these missing person cases might be connected to each other. In particular, The fingerprints Aileen left behind became the biggest pieces of evidence linking her to these missing person and murder cases. Eyewitnesses played an important role in police investigations. Witnesses who had seen Aileen and her girlfriend Terry Moore abandoning victims. Cars together directed police to pursue Aileen. A firearm sold by Aileen at a pawn shop in Florida was examined by police and was found to match the weapon used in Aileen's other murders. The police made an important strategic move in their effort to capture Aileen. They cooperated with her girlfriend Terry Moore. Terry Moore's roller Terry Moore was not present at the scenes where Aileen directly committed the murders. However, it was believed that Moore was aware of many of Aileen's crimes. When police reached Moore, she was frightened and did not want to continue her relationship with Aileen. The police sought to turn this situation to their advantage. They convinced Moore to become a witness against Aileen. Police instructed Moore to conduct a series of telephone conversations with Aileen. Moore was asked carefully prepared questions to get Aileen to admit to her crimes. In these phone conversations, Aileen indirectly admitted to some of the murders. Moore's confessions became critical evidence in the police investigation. Using Moore's information and cooperation, police planned an operation to monitor Aileen. Detectives located a storage unit and discovered that Aileen had stored stolen goods there. Capture: January 9, 1991. Aileen was finally captured on January 9, 1991, at a bar called The Last Resort in Volusia County, Florida. When police learned that she frequented this bar and consumed alcohol there, they took action. Authorities planned a covert operation to avoid drawing attention. Plainclothes police officers outside the bar monitored Aileen's movements. After she spent some time in the bar, they arrested her without incident. Aileen tried to deny her connection to the murders. However, the evidence in the hands of police and the confessions provided by Moore weakened Aileen's defense. Shortly thereafter, Aileen confessed to her crimes and described all the victims as people who had attacked her. This defense became the central argument in her legal proceedings. Trial and execution. Aileen's trial began on January 14, 1992, for the murder of Richard Mallory. Her lawyers argued in defense that Mallory had been convicted of attempted rape in Maryland. However, the judge refused to admit most of the evidence in court. On January 27, 1992, the jury found Aileen guilty of first-degree murder. Despite arguments about the abuse she had suffered, psychiatrists at trial diagnosed Aileen with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. On January 31, 1992, Aileen was sentenced to death. Later, Aileen chose to enter a no-contest plea in cases related to other murders. This, while not admitting guilt, produced the same result on March 31, 1992. For the murders of Spears, Burris, and Humphreys, on May 15, 1992, she received 3 additional death sentences. In June 1992, for the Carskadden murder. In November 1992, she received a 5th death sentence for the Antonio murder. Since Peter Sings's body was never found, Aileen was not formally tried in connection with this murder. Death penalty arguments and final interviews at trial, Aileen attempted to defend herself. However, the evidence presented was heavily against her. In particular, the fact that she had stolen her victims' belongings and pawned them reinforced the belief that Aileen had committed her crimes for financial gain. While awaiting execution, Aileen gave interviews to several journalists and documentary filmmakers. In these interviews, she attempted to defend herself. However, she also revealed her inner world. In interviews, she repeatedly claimed that her victims had threatened her and attempted to assault her. She stated that from the first murder, Mallory had attempted to rape her and had threatened her life. She argued that this claim applied to subsequent victims as well. In some interviews, she admitted to her crimes and explicitly confessed to killing her victims. However, her emotional responses during these confessions were inconsistent. Sometimes she spoke with anger and resentment, and sometimes she admitted to committing the crimes in a calm manner. Women's rights advocates suggested that Aileen's claims should be taken seriously. They emphasized her trauma and the fact that she had been forced to deal with violence. However, the manner in which the victims were killed and her behavior following the murders greatly weakened Aileen's claims of self-defense. As the execution approached, Aileen made increasingly harsh and threatening statements. She targeted the justice system, the media, and everyone she believed had wrongly convicted her. She expressed her anger at the system by saying, "Society destroyed me, and the system is trying to get rid of me through execution." In her final interview, she made threatening statements directed at the world. She said that the price for the injustice she had suffered would be heavy. These threats created a deep sense of dread in society. Social and psychiatric studies of Aileen's crimes and execution process sparked profound discussions about sociology, psychiatry, and justice following her arrest. Evaluations showed that she was psychologically highly unstable and carried the marks of a traumatic past. During the trial, arguments were made that her mental health was impaired. However, these were not sufficiently accepted. The interviews she gave after being sentenced to death suggested paranoid tendencies and a mentally confused state of mind. Her accusations against police, the government, and society at large suggested that she was in conflict not only with the external world but also with her own inner world. Mental health professionals diagnosed Aileen with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. However, these diagnoses were not easily understood and seemed inadequate in explaining her culpability. Although Aileen admitted to her crimes, she gave repeatedly changing statements in her final interviews before execution. Sometimes she said she killed her victims for self-defense, while other times she admitted to killing them in a cold manner. These contradictory statements suggested how variable her psychological state was, and that she sometimes attempted to hide the truth. Execution. October 9, 2002, after years of imprisonment and execution proceedings, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. The execution was carried out at a correctional facility in Starke, Florida. Her last words were, "I'm sailing with the rock." and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back. Aileen Wuornos' death was not merely a tragic end to a woman's life, it passed into history as an event reflecting society's attitudes toward crime, justice, and female criminals. Societal inquiry and Lesson Salen's story compels society to question crime, justice, and the dark aspects of human behavior. Research demonstrates that behind individuals' inclinations to commit crimes lie the traumas they experienced in childhood, neglect, violence, and social exclusion. Aileen's life is a reflection of this very example. The abuse she suffered in childhood, homelessness, economic hardship, and exclusion by society are among the factors that led to her entry into a criminal career. Criminologists note that individuals excluded or marginalized by society are more inclined to act out of a survival instinct. The violence Aileen used in selecting her victims was perhaps an outward expression of the violence she had endured for years. However, this does not justify her crimes. It only helps us understand the reasons behind these crimes. Psychologists note that trauma and violence create a cycle. Individuals who have been mistreated, neglected, or exposed to violence in childhood tend to repeat these behaviors or develop them as their own survival strategies in later years. The tendency of individuals excluded or neglected by society to turn to crime brings to the forefront once again the importance of social justice and social support mechanisms. The traumas Aileen experienced and the social pressure to which she was subjected could increase her potential for criminal behavior. However, the actual decision points that led to her committing these crimes ultimately remain the individual's responsibility. Conclusion: did society create the criminal? Aileen Wuornos' story demonstrates the complexity of the question, did society create killers? It illustrates how difficult this question is to answer. Aileen's tragic life and the crimes she committed passed into history as a multifaceted narrative that questions social structures, our justice system, and human behavior. This story demonstrates how thin the line between crime and punishment can be, how individuals can be affected by social dynamics, and how complex justice can be in such circumstances. At the same time, it serves as a social warning. It reminds us that society needs to better understand the problems individuals face and produce solutions. This story is a dark tableau where crime, trauma, and social neglect converge. The traumas Aileen experienced created a series of factors that drove her to commit crimes. However, this did not eliminate her individual responsibility. For this reason, the complex interaction between individual actions and social contexts regarding crime must be carefully evaluated. Aileen Wuornos' story ends here. However, the story of crime, justice, and society continues to unfold.